John Horne is a former professor of European history and the director of the Centre for War Studies at Trinity College in Dublin. He joins me now live from there to talk a bit more about Armistice Day, also known as Remembrance Day in the UK, Veterans Day in the US. John, this year in France is also the 100th anniversary since an unidentified soldier was buried there underneath the Arc de Triomphe in Paris. Tell us a bit more, if you will, the history behind that.
Yes, it's an interesting and, of course, important ceremony. And oddly, it's one that took place in both France and Britain at exactly the same time. Because of mass death in the First World War, the question of how to commemorate all of the war dead, the millions of them, arose during the war itself. And there was an additional pressure, which was that because of industrial destruction, many of the soldiers of the First World War who died didn't have bodies. The bodies had simply disappeared. And so for those two reasons, the idea gradually emerged of selecting an anonymous, unknown soldier and burying him in a symbolic place, the Arc de Triomphe in Paris, and in fact Westminster Abbey in London, at exactly 100 years ago today. That's what happened. But we look back and we imagine that these ceremonies were always meant to be like that. In fact, there were deep politics behind it. The idea initially was that the unknown soldier would be buried in the Pantheon, as you've just said, the secular temple to the great men and women of the French Republic. But because the Pantheon was associated with the Republic, the political forces on the right objected. And so the compromise was that the soldier would be buried under the Arc de Triomphe. It's also, I think, just briefly worth making the point that 1920 was the 50th anniversary of the Third Republic, which, of course, had been born in defeat by Germany in 1870. This was its kind of triumph. So the idea was also that the heart of Léon Gambetta, the figure who'd led national defense, a kind of Clemenceau before Clemenceau, if you like, in 1870, would also be buried in the Pantheon 100 years ago today. That did indeed happen. So there was a ceremony, the stilled streets of Paris, in which the two coffins were carried through the streets. The unknown soldier left at the Arc de Triomphe, where he was formally buried the following January, and the heart of Gambetta taken to the Pantheon, which is an odd and fitting kind of echo with what we'll see later on today, the inhumation of the remains of Maurice Genevoix, one of the great soldier writers of the Great War, in that same Pantheon.
John, tell us a bit more about Maurice Genevoix, who President Macron has said is one of his favorite authors.
Yes, he is one of the great writers of the First World War. He was a student in 1914, already dedicated to literary studies. He was mobilized. He fought and was severely wounded in April 1915. Now, you might think that he hadn't seen much of the war, but in fact, those first 9 months of the war were the most lethal months of the conflict. That was why trench warfare had to be invented. It was when France and Germany experienced their greatest losses, and Genevoix was, in April 1915, was wounded, and he remained handicapped for the rest of his life. He went back to Paris and decided that rather than take up his studies again, he would write. And what he wrote was a series of 4, how to describe them? They're novels, but they're novels which are also witnesses. They're kind of stories very true to his own experience. And indeed, he based the first of them on the war diary which he'd kept at the front. These 4 novels, only one of which was ever translated into English, were then brought together after the Second World War under the title of Ceux de 14, those of 1914. And if you like, it becomes the kind of literary monument to the French soldiers' experience of the horrors, of the sacrifices of the Great War, but also, and Genevoix never calls this into question, of the need to have fought that war. And the other brief point which is worth making about him is that after the Second World War, he becomes the pioneering figure who sets up the Mémorial de Verdun, which is the memorial museum on the battlefield of Verdun, commemorating the Battle of 1916, which he'd left the war before that happened. But he was the president of the association which set up that museum, opened in 1967. And if you go there, and I know they'll be commemorating Genevoix today at the Mémorial de Verdun, you will see that it's the last kind of collective statement by the veterans of 1914-18. They all gave their material to make that museum. So it's this double importance, I think, of Genevoix as the writer-chronicler of the French soldiers' experience, and as the spokesman for the veterans and the setting up of this final museum to their experience, which really makes him the witness, what we would probably use the word now, the great literary survivor of the Great War.
John,
and so it's doubly fitting
John, we just have a minute.
He's going to...
I'm so sorry. We just have a minute left. Just a question that comes back again and again at these ceremonies. We're now at a point where World War I ended 102 years ago today. Do you think the world has learned the lessons of that Great War? The numbers of what several countries went through are astounding.
Yes. They are, absolutely. I mean, over 10 million military deaths in all. I would reply very briefly this way. I think that it goes in waves. I think there are lessons which were learned. And in fact, Genevoix, when he set up that memorial at Verdun, in his inaugural speech, he said, this is a place of reconciliation. And the site of Verdun, as you know, became a place of reconciliation between the French and Germans, without which the European project could never have been born. But when we look at what's happening today in Nagorno-Karabakh, when we look around at the world and the militant and nationalist language which is being spoken again, I think, unfortunately, it's possible that lessons which were once learned can be unlearned. And I think there's a lot of unlearning going on at the moment.
John, thank you so much for sharing your expertise with us. It's always great to have a historian's perspective. John Horne, they're the director of the Center for War Studies at Trinity College Dublin. Thank you so much.